All right, cool. So the stream's going. Welcome back. Hope you all had a pretty solid reading week. Hope you participated in the game jam. And if not this one, there's always the next one. Uh, but that was a good time. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. Today we're going to be diving headfirst into a pretty big topic. So buckle up, and it's one that I'm super passionate about, and it is none other than adaptive music. So today we're just going to be talking about what linear and adaptive music are, how they work, why they're so important, and a bit more about them. So, kicking it off, let's look real quick at just music and the purpose it serves in a game. All right, so some of the things it does, you probably already know this. I know I've said this in different sessions before, but some of the main things that music does is it can help engage and immerse the player into the game world. It can give the player information. So if the music is super intense, that usually means, oh, I'm in combat, or oh, there's something intense going on, and vice versa for something if it's a bit more calmer. It can pull emotions out of the player with like um, really key themes that keep repeating at key points in the story, or something like that. Or it can go the doom route of pulling out a lot of aggression out of the player and make them, feel like they just did 3 lines of coke or something. Um, Whatever emotions it pulls out of the player, music can do that. But the great thing about game music and the way it is unique is that it can change dynamically based on the player's input. Um, and through that, there are two main types of games, or two main types of music that are found in games. So there's linear music and adaptive music, which obviously, from the title of this one, adaptive music is the main one we're going to be looking at. But to understand it, we got to first look at linear music. So, what are they? Uh, let's just start off with linear, because, like I said, you need to know linear to understand adaptive. So, what is it? It is pretty much every non game piece of music that has ever been written. So, this is the stuff you listen to on the radio, it's stuff you hear in commercials, in movies. If you listen to a game soundtrack just on your own, that's linear music. Um, and basically, simple definition of it is it plays from start to the end without any variation at all. So you listen to it once, it'll be the exact same if you listen to it again. And take a shot every time I say there's blank amount of something. But there are 3 types of linear music that are found in games. So there's the linear loop, there's the stinger, and there's the one shot. So just remember when we're going through these, all 3 of these play from start to the end without any variation at all. So the linear loop is the first type. It's pretty simple. It's a linear piece that loops. So it plays once and then it starts again, plays the whole thing again, keeps going. It could loop forever if you wanted it to, but you probably wouldn't want that because it would probably get annoying. Um, so longer pieces that are loops usually have a bit more variety and develop over time just to make it a bit more engaging to listen to. Um, and another way to keep it safe from repetition is having a lack of true melody. So something like the slow texture method, which is basically making it an ambient piece with chords fading and swelling gently, with very gradual transitions to the next chord. So it's great for building atmosphere, also great for looping without the player noticing or getting annoyed because they can't really hear any distinct melody. And just a couple ways to make things loop well. You can end it how it began. So for these, I'm just going to use a couple examples from normal linear music. So Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album, it starts with a heartbeat and it ends with a heartbeat. So if you listen to it in a loop, which you couldn't really do back in the day, but you can now with technology, if you listen to it in a loop, it'll end with a heartbeat and it'll kind of carry over the heartbeat at the beginning. So you'll be like, oh, okay, it loops, it's the same it's the same thing. You could also have two halves of the same section. So another Pink Floyd example, The Wall. It starts with the words "We came in," and then it ends with the words "Is this where?" So you listen to the end, loop it to the beginning. It's "Is this where we came in?" It makes sense with the album. But the point of that is it's two halves of the same section. It's one sentence chopped in half, and that kind of makes the loop a bit more clean. Then you can do the answer question or response call, which if you have any sort of jazz background or know anything about usually jazz music, there's a thing called a call and response or a question answer, which is one line says something and then another line says another thing, or two instruments will do that and they'll go back and forth. So you start the piece with the answer, quote unquote, and then you end the loop with the question. So that way, you hit the end, there's the question, and then it's immediately followed by the answer, and that makes it a bit more cohesive. And one last one, another jazz term is a vamp. This is kind of similar to the slow texture method, but more musical. Vamps are basically just looped chord progressions that play while the melody goes over top of it. So the melody would then be really the only main indication that it's looped, because the vamp just goes on the whole time. But yeah, those are a couple ways to make linear loops function in music. But two things you gotta always watch out for, and this is just for any sound in general. Reverb tails, you always want to be careful with those. Those are on the bottom, pictured in the bottom left. They're basically just the trail that happens after a sound happens. So if you stand in a very large room and you yell and then immediately close your mouth, you'll still hear a bit of it fade away. That's what the reverb is. So loops, obviously, if a note ends, you don't want to hear it trail off, and then loop. You want to hear it end and then immediately on the next note, just seamlessly loop. So one way to make it loop with reverb is to chop the end of it off. Oh, is my mic really loud? Here, I'll turn it down a little bit. Oh, it's just you. Okay. But if you chop the end of a loop off and stick it right at the beginning to kind of overlap with the first note, then it'll be a seamless loop. But another thing you got to watch out for is the zero crossing point, which is pictured in the bottom right. And that's basically in a sound form, you got the squiggly lines, you got the sine waves, but where the line is in the middle, that's the 0 point. And what you want to do is you always want to have it so that the beginning and the end of a song or a track or a sound or anything really is centered on that zero crossing. So a couple ways to do that, or one way to do it. Extremely short fade in and fade outs is pretty much the best way to do it. So it doesn't need to be extremely short as in like a second. I'm talking like a tenth of a second is pretty long. So like literally only like 20-30 samples, just do a fade in fade out. It'll be imperceptible, nobody will ever notice, but it won't have a click, because if it isn't on zero and they're not lined up properly, when it loops it will click. That's noticeable 9 times out of 10 versus super easy fix, unnoticeable. It's just a good practice to do. Even with sound design as well. If you're doing a sound, make sure it ends at the zero crossing point. Make sure it starts at the zero crossing point. So that's loops. Now you got stingers. So generally speaking, they're a really short piece that alerts the player of something. It could be a note like the alert sound in Metal Gear, or it could be something like when you discover a chest in Zelda, and then you open it up and it plays that little song. That's a stinger as well. So they basically just alert the player of something. usually they're supposed to be complementary to the main track that's playing. So there's the background music that's going on through the whole level, and then something happens to trigger a stinger, and the stinger should then complement the piece. Um, or another way to do it. So that's one way of doing stingers. There's a couple ways. But another way is to use transitional stingers to string different loops together. So this is getting a bit more into the territory of adaptive music. So we'll definitely touch on this in a couple minutes. Um, but stingers can be used to bring or to go from one loop to another seamlessly. And since they're usually played on top of another track, an atonal approach can be pretty useful. So that could be something like percussion. It could be something like either really low or really high sounds. It could be a crash cymbal. Just anything that isn't exactly in one key. That way it could be used on any track in the game. That is a pretty helpful approach to it, and that can definitely help you out. So that's loops and stingers, and now we're on to one-shots. So these are kind of like stingers. They play once from start to beginning. They don't loop. But the special thing about one-shots is that they are less frequent in gameplay than stingers are. So perfect example of this that I always go to is in Red Dead Redemption when you ride into Mexico. As long as you keep riding, and the song hasn't ended yet, it'll play a song written by Jose Gonzalez that was just in the game. So they put that in there, make it a bit more special. It's a super impressive moment. And yeah, that's an example of a one shot because that only happens at that point in the game. So there are a few different uses for one shots. You got in-game one shots, so that example. And you got cinematics and cutscenes. So any cutscene, it's scored like a film basically from all the. You just take the cutscene in its entirety and then write a song to it. That's usually how it's done. But the song that's playing along with the cutscene, that would be considered a one shot. And there's also scripted events. So all the Uncharted games out there with all the dozens and dozens of scripted events, all that has music. Again, it's tailored to what the event is. So it's kind of like a mix between the in-game one-shot and the cinematics, since the player does have control, but not complete control. All right, so that's linear music. But what's its point in games? What's the point of it? So, linear music, as you know it, so like trailers, stuff like that, it's really useful for promotional materials. And by really useful, I mean you literally could not have it without it. So that's stuff like trailers, commercials, gameplay, showcases, anything that promotes your game. You're probably gonna want to use linear music, because how else are you gonna put music in there since they're not interacting with the promotional material 9 times out of 10. So you also got stuff like menus, you got credits, cutscenes, and other authored gameplay segments. And I threw menus and credits in there because the player isn't interacting with the game at that point. Like yeah, they're going through the options, and you could make it adaptive, like the Mario Kart menus, for example. The further you get into a menu and closer you get to actually racing, the more elements are added, which is really cool. And I might need to do a look into that here one day. But 9 times out of 10, most menus are just a loop or a couple loops or something like that. But most importantly, linear music is integral to adaptive music, which we're going to look at now. So, if linear music just plays from start to end without changing, adaptive music, put simply, is music that reacts to changes in the world, or triggers. And it only dates back to the 90s, like the mid-90s-ish. So it's still relatively recent in terms of video games, but it is, it's pretty prominent now. So again, take a shot. I say every time I say there are two types of this, but there are two main types of adaptive music, um, or at least two different categories that you could see different parts falling under. There are horizontal resequencing and vertical layering, and we're going to talk about both of those just in a sec. But the most important thing about adaptive music is that it could not be done without linear music, um, and we'll get into why in a sec. So, first things first, we're going to look at horizontal resequencing. And if you have any knowledge of music, just think of this in terms of bars. So you have the first four bars of a piece, and then after that, the next four bars, and so on and so on. So each of these bars, think of them as chunks of a song, or even like a verse, chorus, bridge sort of thing. Each of those sections is a chunk of it. But think that you can rearrange them. So instead of going verse, verse, you go verse, chorus, or something like that. And yeah, a linear track is basically just chunks strung together, but linearly and without any way of changing it. So, a couple ways to do it. To resequence the track horizontally, you could blend tracks together using either crossfades, which is a bit more boring but a bit more practical, or transitional tracks, which is the big, powerful Sigma male Mega Chad way. I don't know why I wrote that, of doing it. So that would be taking a stinger, and then basically sticking it between two loops. So you have one loop playing, something's triggered in the game world. Oh, you're going to this location? Cool. We'll switch tracks basically. So then it'll go from that one loop, it'll end that loop, it'll play the stinger, and then that stinger will ease the transition into the next loop. So it's a little more difficult to do that, but literally the first game to ever utilize adaptive music, which was The Secret of Monkey Island 2, I believe, it used this to incredible effect and still stands to this day as an incredible example of transitional tracks being used. But put very simply, horizontal resequencing is moving between different loops in a track. So that leaves vertical layering. So if horizontal resequencing is the bars or the different sections of a song, then vertical layering would be the different chords, so like all the notes on top of each other in the same time, or the different instrument parts that are playing along at the same time. So each of them are in the same bar, but they're playing two very different things. So there could be two parts in a song. There's the bass that plays the same thing in both tracks, and then a guitar is added in the second one. You could do the horizontal approach of both. There are two different tracks. One loop just has the bass, one loop has the bass and guitar, or you can do the vertical layering approach of the one track with the bass, and then based on a condition, you can add in the guitar on top. So that's just an example of how both of these can be used to achieve the same thing. So a couple ways to do it. Once again, fade ins or fade outs of additional layers of a piece at different points. So if you had one track going, but you wanted to fade into, let's say, a combat track, the game Ultra Kill does this, as it has an ambient version of the song and it has the combat version playing at the same time. And if you enter combat, it'll just slowly fade in the volume, or fade the volume up of the combat track. But they're both playing at all times. You just don't hear the combat track when you're not in combat. So you can do that. You can add or remove layers based on conditions. So similarly, if you're not in combat anymore, the combat part goes away, but the base layer is still there. But the main thing you have to be careful of is you have to be really conscious of how everything will blend together, which is true for just adding instruments when you're actually writing a song anyways, but it's especially true when you're adding additional layers to something that's already considered an individual piece. Because one thing I read a while ago is you should consider the bass track one standalone piece that can work on its own. You should consider the layers um, standalone as well, so that way everything can work together. All right, so what are kind of the applications of this? Um, so, like I said near the beginning, the point of music in games, since it changes based on input, you can alert the player to changes in the game state or give feedback to the player. So whether that's you move to a different location, the time of day changed if you're um, like in Animal Crossing or Breath of the Wild or something, or any other game that has a night and day system and music hooked up to that. You could be alerted to the stats and values that the player has. So let's say your health is really low, you apply a low pass filter, or you take away um, a few layers to make the music a bit more sparse. If you're going really fast in a driving game, that could speed up the music, change the tempo of it, or anything really. Because even something like Mario, I believe it was Mario 3, the one where you can ride Yoshi. There's one track for the level. You hop on Yoshi, bongos are added. Adaptive music. It's very simple, but it's a great way to alert the player of feedback. And probably, well, second most important, because feedback and changes of the game state probably the most important, is it keeps the player interested. Because if you just have one loop going for the entire game, and even if it's 5 minutes of gameplay, it'll probably get stale by the end of it. So constantly changing up the track, constantly switching out different sections, alerting the player to what's going on in the game, that'll be very useful to keep them interested, especially in endless or long scenarios. So we've talked about how or what it is. Now let's talk about how we even do it in the first place. So, as with most things relating to game development, there's rarely a one size fits all solution to this, with a bunch of different techniques being possible and viable. Like I gave with the vertical layering and horizontal resequencing example of the bass and guitar, you could do both of those things in two different ways. Um, so, we're just going to get into a few of them that I've done, just to get the train rolling. And disclaimer, I really want to put the emphasis on the fact that I've done this. So all the stuff I'm going to show off is stuff I've worked on. So just putting it out there that I'm still very much learning. And to really emphasize this, I'm going to point out where I've progressed. I'll show all the bad things, and where I can improve, just so we can all learn from it. Because everyone can profit from a bad example. Or even if it's a good example, which there's one out of the 4 or 5 I've put in here, it's still good to see what could then be improved. So, first one, this is one of the first adaptive quote-unquote tracks I did, and by my current standards, it's pretty ass, but this is just to lay the foundations of what was to come. So, just to kind of give you an idea of what the game was and required, it was an FPS with procedurally placed room prefabs. That's kind of hard to say. Filled with enemies. Wow. So basically, how I looked at the music was, okay, the player is either in combat or they're not in combat, and you can't really say because the prefabs are always changing. So while they're in one room, or in between two sections, it should be just one track, and then when they go to a new one, switch to a different track, and so on. So with that, I wrote each of the tracks to have an intro, a non-combat section, a combat section, and an end, with the occasional transition piece between the sections. So this is an example of horizontal resequencing, with the switch being from non-combat to combat, and switching to a different section, which was done in the code. So a couple good things about this: it was simple and it worked. Each of the sections was in their own files. So as you can see, there's the intro, there's non-combat, the transition, combat, and the end. All of those were in their own isolated wave files. So that made it really easy to adjust things if I needed to. Um, and they were all in one compact file, which you'll understand why I'm really emphasizing that in the next slide. Um, so it makes it easy to tell at a glance what things were and how to implement them. The parameters were pretty well done, surprisingly, for my first go at this. The in combat parameter that controls the swapping between the combat and non-combat sections. Um, and then the level clear that would play the end, and the is pause that would just drop the volume of the entire thing. So a couple bad things about it. It's fairly minimal, which isn't terrible. But I could have done a bit more. Um, Granted, I was a little rushed towards the end of development for this one, but it's fine. It's pretty repetitive since there's just two looping sections that swap between each other. Um, and there's pretty basic use of parameters. I could have gone a bit more involved. Like the is paused parameter could have applied a filter to it instead of just making the music quieter. But once again, I was learning. This was a first try and not a horrible first attempt. So here is the other combat track I did for Primordial, which at a glance is a lot more impressive looking than the other one, but under the hood it is honestly pretty terrible, since it's basically the exact same as the other example, in terms of functionality. So once again, it's a good example of how resequencing works, with two loops and all the transitions between the two sections. Um, and this time I did have a transition out of the combat section instead of just a transition from non-combat to combat. So a couple of good things. I certainly used a lot of what was available. I used volume and panning automation clips. I used a lot of transitions. Um, and yeah, I really used it to a lot of effect. Um, Couple other good things. The transitions out of each section made it flow a lot better, and the parameters did help to enable the resequencing. But there's quite a few bad things here. The automation clip part, that could have easily been done in my DAW. I don't know why I didn't do it in there, but I could have easily just done that in FL Studio, written that into the actual song, and then pulled it in and put it in here, without needing to worry about doing it in Fmod. And as much as possible, should have been squished down into a handful of tracks instead of each pattern being its own stem. Because as you can tell, I have patterns for each instrument on every single track. And instead of doing that, I could have just squashed it down and be like, okay, I wrote it this way, I'll just stick it in this way since it already works. And especially because I'm not doing any randomization or anything like that. So I'm not entirely sure why I did it this way, but it's fine. And one last thing, since Fmod does have a transition region object, that we'll see in a minute, that could have been easy to just squash everything, all of those many transitions down into literally 3 objects, or 2 objects or something. So yeah, it's an improvement, but it's also like 3 steps back. So, fast forward a little while, we're on our next game, which I knew I wanted to go all out with, since I kind of dropped the artist role and just went straight into sound. And since I started getting really deep in all this last year, I really wanted to put it all to practice. So here's the main menu, which isn't super adaptive, but it's still got a little bit of adaptivity in there. And just to showcase that nothing needs to be too crazy if it doesn't need to be. So obviously, like I said a couple minutes ago with menus, the player generally isn't interacting with them too much. And in this case, you weren't. So it's just a loop after an intro bit. So it plays once without any adaptivity, loops for the one section, and that green thing, the scatterer down there, it plays a certain piano melody every once in a while, just randomly. So it's super simple since it's essentially just a loop um, with one random element, but it works. So one good thing, the use of the scatterer to add more variety. It's a great tool to use. I would highly recommend it. And bad, again, all the individual patterns. I could have really done this in just a small handful of wave files, and I could have saved a lot of room. So next, one of the next songs I worked on. Here's where I started figuring out a bit more of what I was doing with this approach. Um, and how I looked at levels for this game, Earth's Light, was a little different from Primordial, our previous game, since the whole thing was with Primordial was randomization. You never know which room you're going to be in or if you're in combat or not. Versus this game having a fairly linear approach and having everything pretty curated in comparison. So I would essentially get Hamraj, who designed all the levels, to give me a walkthrough of the level he'd be working on, and I would just note down all the key points. So how the level starts, the first combat encounter, what the player does after that, so platforming, more combat, etc. Then I would take this linear string of events, narrow them down to the essentials, and figure out what would need to loop when. So, okay, there could be one combat track, and then after that it goes into the platforming section. Cool. Um, and then after that, I would just write down the parts, or write the parts for each of them, and then from there, slap it into Fmod. So we're just going to take a closer look at one of the sections before getting into the goods and bads. But I do want to point out that those green things with the arrows, those are the transition regions I was talking about. And I use them all the time now, because they are very useful. So this is the inside of one of the sections, and this is probably the most involved section, which is why I wanted to show it. So a couple good things about it. Each of their sections are in their own event, which you can see here with the fact that it's two lines. There's the top instrument, quote unquote, with all the events, and then on the second line, that's just a stinger that plays when you do a QTE. So each of the sections being their own event, which is referenced in the big one, adds a lot more customizability to it. All you got to do is slap a loop over it, and it's fine. I use transition regions to great effect, and I quantize them to transition every bar or few bars, which compared to what I did with Primordial is the same thing, just a lot easier to look at, a lot easier to do, since I'm not just spamming copy paste as much, at least. And I used multi-instruments, which are the teal boxes in the second row, which essentially, when it plays one of the three tracks, or one of the multiple tracks, hence multi-instrument, that are in the multi-instrument. So we're going to get into a lot of that in a different session I've planned. But yeah, multi-instruments, I use them here. They're great. You should definitely look into them. And I also used another scatterer instrument to add a bit more variety in the track. And as you can tell, there's a lot more tracks in this scatterer than there were in the previous one. I believe there's about 15 or 16. I'm pretty sure it was just like individual notes played on a synth, but it really did help add to the atmosphere and the uniqueness of this track, since every time you hear it, you never know which of these notes would be played in what order. So a couple of the bad things. Again, I kept exporting all the patterns, so there were way too many files, especially since, as you can see, a lot of this just loops. Like the bottom three instruments here, they are the exact same in every single bar. So I could have easily just exported a couple of them in a row and then just slapped them in like that, saved a lot of space. I didn't use loops for some reason in this section. I used transition regions. So as you can see, it gets to the end and there's a transition to the main loop. I could have just done a loop there. I'm not sure why I did that. And I didn't need to throw in tempo markers for each and every section, because right here, as you can see above each of the labels, there's a tempo marker, and they're all the same. So I don't know why I did that, since at the beginning the first one would set it, and then it doesn't change after that, so it'd be the same. But alas, you live and you learn. And just a bit of a rewind real quick. This is the first track I made for the game. And since Primordial's music was pretty primitive, I wanted to and needed to learn the ropes of adaptive music for this to work. And unknowingly did a pretty interesting technique that I kind of wanted to show off, since I haven't actually done it since. But this track clearly has nothing on it, since I have since deleted most of it. But the gist is this. I didn't export the things as sections. Once again, all of this that you're looking at is part of the exploration track, with a linear progression through each section, which is where all the loops are. But here's where the unique part comes in. I would throw in a bit of vertical layering into this, because the big yellow line on the bottom, that was actually the combat track. So when the in combat parameter was flicked to 1, it would blend the current track into whatever the combat track was. So vertical layering. But it's a weird version of layering, since it's essentially just fading in the combat music on top of any of the exploration tracks. But I mean, it worked, and it was kind of neat. So I just wanted to show that off real quick as well, because that's a good mix between the two sides of adaptive music. And with this constant improvement, here's more or less my best adaptive music track, using this linear approach I've developed for horizontal resequencing. And this is the track to the Woodlands level in our gamer slate. So this level's a little bit different from the others in that it has a few non-linear moments, with the players returning to a hub area a few times. So originally when Hamraj did the walkthrough of the level, I really wanted to kill him, because there are around 25 unique sections, and it was really difficult to narrow it down, since we had added wave-based combat encounters, and he added in all this non-linearity. So I was like, okay, this is going to be interesting, because I wanted to have different combat music each section, or each wave, to show the progression of the combat encounter. So I sucked it up. I lumped as much together as I reasonably could. I got it down to 19 individual sections. I accounted for the nonlinearity of the hub section and a few of the collectibles that you would have to go out of your way for. I made a big planning doc, which I would highly recommend. Just like plan out the music, figure out, okay, what do we need to do? Where do we need it? And then go from there, because that was honestly instrumental for the writing process for this song. And yeah, so I got it down to 19 sections, and 2 of the combat encounters had 3 waves each. So a few of the good things. The parameters, I think this is probably my best work with parameters. There's the progress, which, as you can probably guess, it moves between each of the sections. A QTE parameter that would reset after you do it. I managed that in Fmod, so if you flick it to 1, it would automatically go back to 0. Although we did do that in engine as well, just to double check. But essentially, in the certain QTE areas, if you were to do the QTE, it would then play the stinger for it. And it didn't matter where you were, when you were, it would play it, which was great. There were the combat 3 and 4 wave counters, which are the 2 other parameters as well, and those would essentially just count up from 1 to 3, and that would change the section of the combat encounter. And I finally lumped all the patterns together in one exported track. So as you can see, if you look closely at the yellow reference tracks, they are lumped together. They are not just a ton of files that could have been one. I lumped together as much as I possibly could for these, and it turned out really well. I also used a bit of vertical layering with the QTE stinger, Like I said, it plays whenever you do it, not whenever the song gets to it, which was great. I used leitmotifs in my writing, which isn't really an adaptive music thing, but it can really help with adaptive music. Because one of the optional sections, it took you back to overlook the hub area. And since the hub area has a very distinct melody to it, I took the music of the section that leads into it, into that collectible area, and just added the melody of the hub area to it. And then boom, added themes to the game. And with the adaptive music always changing, hearing that, you could be like, oh, I'm close to this area. So great for adaptive music in that way. And a couple of the bad things, I could have used a bit more vertical layering techniques. I could have done something a little bit different with the QTE to make it a bit better. But honestly, the current implementation is fine. I actually used no multi-instruments or scatterers in this track, which when I realized the other day when I was making this, I was kind of kicking myself for it because there's a bit less variation that could have been in the track, despite this track being 11 and a half minutes of unique music. Thank you, Hamraj, once again for a very long level. But yeah, adding in those multi-instruments and scatterers can really help kind of spice it up. So, what kind of techniques do you get from this? Neither of these really have names from what I know, so I just kind of gave them my names that I came up with. So there's my linear approach, which is great for linear experiences. That's what I was kind of developing this whole time through each of those examples. It relies on horizontal resequencing a lot and doesn't require too much vertical layering unless there's, say, an interactive element that could happen at any time, like for instance a QTE event that would then be added in through vertical layering. And there's the different sections of each section of the level, so it makes it really easy to look at, really easy to transition to and from each part. And there is one single parameter that dictates the progress, which is fantastic. So that kind of approach has been super useful for me, as you can probably tell. But it's great for linear games, not the best for emergent experiences. So then there is the aptly named Wetlands Action approach, which is a bit better for emergent experiences from what I found. So it relies on horizontal resequencing once again, but with a bit more vertical layering in there, and basically just have a parameter for something. It could be combat, health, the wave number, anything really. That adds another layer to the song. And then there's a parameter for the level progress once again. So, two kind of similar ways that I've developed, but both of them I found very fruitful for different things. So, yeah, your mileage may vary, but hopefully it doesn't vary too much, or else, yeah, I'd be telling you lies. So obviously, this isn't all there is. This is just what I've done in the very short time that I've been doing this. So another way you can do it is just experiment and think about how you'd want music to progress and change with the game as the player experiences it. Then write it down and just think about how it'll work and try to make it happen. So learning is all about experimentation, as you probably know. Excuse me. And trying to find solutions to just weird problems, especially in game dev. So don't be afraid to try new and weird things, because if it pans out, great. If it doesn't, awesome, you learned from it. Now you know a way that could either work for something else or a way to not do it. So I might need to do a session in the future about more techniques, because I've been thinking about that. I've had a few ideas written down. But that's pretty much it for adaptive music. Thanks for coming out. Next week we're going to be looking at game accessibility with game sound. So really excited about that one. Really hope to see you there. And as always, if you have any questions about adaptive music, because it is a very big topic and I kind of blasted through it, yeah, feel free to shoot a message in the Discord. Um, and yeah, that's pretty much it.